Corin refuses to serve a black woman. Then the Secret Service arrives. It started with the sound of bells tinkling on the diner's glass door, those tiny chimes that usually evoke warmth and welcome. On a bright, crisp morning in suburban Virginia, Ebony stepped inside Rosewood Diner, hoping to find a quick breakfast and a little solace before her busy day began. She had parked her Navy sedan just outside, letting its engine idle for a few moments while she double-checked her schedule on her phone. Her dark hair was swept into a neat updo, and she wore a simple tailored jacket paired with dark slacks. The jacket's discreet lapel pin, a golden eagle, was a subtle hint about her line of work, but most people didn't notice it unless they knew what to look for. Inside, the diner's was a throwback to the 1960s, chrome-edged tables, red vinyl booths, and black and white checkered floors. Photographs of old county fairs and local sports teams dotted the walls. Normally, Ebony found charm in these quaint, nostalgic settings, but that morning she was too preoccupied to admire the. She had an important briefing to prepare for, a meeting that could shape the next few months of policy discussions at her workplace. The lingering anxiety tugged at her thoughts, so she headed straight for the counter, determined to order coffee and something light to eat. She noticed it wasn't terribly busy. A smattering of diners occupied a few tables while a single waitress bustled back and forth, refilling coffee mugs. Ebony slid onto a stool at the counter. She set her purse in her lap and scanned the menu. She was thinking a simple omelet with a side of wheat toast would do, or maybe a fruit bowl if they had one. She was about to call out a polite, "Good morning," to catch the waitress's attention when she heard someone clear their throat loudly behind the counter. "Can I help you?" The voice was clipped, direct, and not remotely friendly. Ebony looked up, meeting the eyes of a woman in her early 50s with short, frosted hair. She wore a pink polo shirt, the diner's name embroidered on the left side, and a name tag that read Corin. In Ebony's experience, most servers started conversations with a smile or a cheerful greeting, especially at a place like Rosewood Diner that prided itself on home-style cooking and hospitality. But Corin's demeanor was anything but cheerful. "Yes, please," Ebony replied softly, managing a polite smile. "I'd like a coffee, black, and do you have egg white omelets on the menu?" Corin's lips thinned. "We serve regular omelets. If you want anything special, we can't do that today. We're short-staffed." The abrupt rudeness caught Ebony off guard. She glanced around, noticing there was hardly a rush in the diner. "Regular is fine," Ebony said, still trying to keep her composure. "A regular omelet with peppers and onions, whole wheat toast if you have it. That would be great, thank you." Corin made an unimpressed face, grabbed a small order pad, and wrote something down with brisk strokes. "Anything else?" she asked, voice flat. "No, that's all for now," Ebony said. She felt an odd tension in the air, a quiet hostility emanating from Corin's gaze. It wasn't the typical morning grumpiness that some servers had. It was something else, a kind of instant judgment Ebony had seen before, though she tried not to assume. She reminded herself to stay calm. She would eat quickly and leave. Corin tore the order slip off the pad, barely glancing at Ebony as she pivoted and headed toward the kitchen. Ebony exhaled, turning her attention back to her phone. She had a stream of unread messages from her boss, urgent notes on the upcoming briefing. As she read, her coffee arrived. Corin set it down with a clatter, some of the hot liquid splashing onto the saucer. Ebony attempted a quiet "thank you," but Corin was already walking away without acknowledgement. Minutes trickled past. Ebony sipped the coffee, bitter and a touch burnt, but at least it was hot, and tried to focus on the documents on her screen. The voices in the diner droned around her, forks clicking on plates, a baby cooing at a booth near the entrance. She felt herself beginning to relax despite Corin's frosty demeanor. She reminded herself that not everyone would be friendly, and that was okay. She wasn't here for conversation, just a quick meal. Time dragged on, and Ebony realized it had been over 15 minutes. She saw other tables being served promptly, pancakes, toast, bacon. In fact, the couple who walked in 10 minutes after her were already cutting into their scrambled eggs. Ebony, however, had yet to see her omelet. She glanced around, trying to catch Corin's eye, but Corin was busy topping off the coffee of two white-haired men at a booth. Ebony waited patiently, not wanting to cause a scene. Eventually, Ebony decided to approach the far end of the counter where Corin stood punching in an order on the register. Ebony offered a gentle smile, determined to keep the interaction civil. "Excuse me, I was just wondering about my omelet. Is it still on its way?" Corinne didn't bother to hide her annoyance. I told you we're short-staffed. You'll get it when it's ready. Ebony swallowed her frustration. I understand. It's just been a while, and I see others who came in after me have already been served. Corinne's gaze hardened. Are you trying to accuse me of something? Because you can see I'm busy. Ebony's heartbeat quickened. She felt the prickle of embarrassment on the back of her neck. A couple of other diners glanced over. She was all too familiar with this scenario, being painted as difficult or pushy for simply asking a question. She inhaled slowly. No, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just checking on the status. If it's going to take a lot longer, I may need to head out. Corinne let out a derisive snort. If you want to leave, then leave. Suits me just fine. She turned abruptly and strode into the kitchen, letting the door swing shut behind her. Ebony stood there, stunned. For a moment, she contemplated walking out. Yet she also felt a twinge of indignation. Why was she being treated like she didn't belong here at all? Why did she have to slink away without the meal she had politely requested? Shaking her head, Ebony decided to give it a few more minutes. Maybe Corinne was just having a rough day. Ebony returned to her seat at the counter and tried to distract herself again with her phone, going over briefing notes and potential points she'd bring up in her meeting. 15 more minutes passed. Ebony's coffee cup was nearly empty, and not once did Corinne come by to offer a refill. Ebony could see the minutes ticking away on her phone's lock screen, reminding her that if she stayed much longer, she'd risk being late for her official duties. She sighed, gathering her purse. She was about to leave when the kitchen door burst open and Corinne emerged, carrying a plate. She walked up to Ebony, set the plate down with a loud clang, and slid it across the counter. Your omelet, Corinne said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Ebony looked at the plate. The omelet appeared overcooked, dark around the edges. The toast was white bread, not whole wheat, and half of it looked burned. She raised her eyes to Corinne, mustering politeness. Thank you. Could I get some water, please? Corinne looked exasperated. We have self-serve water at the station by the door, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the entrance. Help yourself. Ebony nodded, resisting the urge to argue. She slid off the stool, walked to the small station where a pitcher of water and plastic cups stood. She poured herself a cup. As she returned to the counter, she heard the tail end of Corinne's audible muttering, something about people wanting everything handed to them, in a tone laced with disdain. Ebony felt her stomach clench. The implication was clear enough. She tried to remind herself to remain calm, but her patience was wearing thin. She wasn't here to demand special treatment. She just wanted a basic level of courtesy. She cut into the omelet. It was watery in the middle, rubbery on the edges. Ebony realized she no longer even had an appetite. She ate a few bites, mostly to stave off hunger, then pushed her plate away. She'd had enough. She reached for her wallet, planning to pay and get out of there. That was when she overheard Corinne talking to someone near the cash register. Let me guess, Corinne said loudly, not bothering to hide her words. She's going to complain it wasn't good enough, try to get a free meal. Typical. Ebony froze, mouth going dry. She could feel a rush of heat spread across her cheeks. She stood, wallet in hand, and walked over. I'd like to pay for my meal, she said, her voice tight but measured. Corinne faced her, arms crossed. That'll be $9.50, cash only. Ebony glanced at the diner's window, where a sign clearly listed all major credit cards accepted. She started to say something, but decided it wasn't worth it. She pulled out a $10 bill, placed it on the counter. Keep the change, she said, turning to leave. Corinne snorted. I'm sure you think that makes you generous. Ebony pivoted, unable to let the comment slide this time. Look, I don't know what your issue is, she said quietly, trying to maintain composure. I'm just a paying customer who came in for breakfast. I'm not sure why you've been so rude. Corinne's expression hardened. It's not my fault you people always play the victim card. You don't like the service. Fine, don't come back. There it was, the dagger Ebony had been bracing for. The hateful subtext was no longer subtext. The color drained from Ebony's face. She felt a quiver in her voice but refused to let her tone rise. I'm not playing any card, she said. I came in for breakfast, and I was treated with hostility from the moment I walked through the door. Corinne scoffed. Go ahead, complain to management. Oh wait, I am management. My family owns this diner. She gave a smug smile. So good luck with that. At that moment, Ebony could feel her chest tighten as a swirl of frustration and humiliation welled up inside her. She glanced around, noticing the uncomfortable stares of other diners. Some looked sympathetic. Others quickly turned their eyes away. Ebony pressed her lips together. She had a duty to get to, an important job that required her to maintain composure and not let personal battles consume her. But she also knew walking away without addressing this blatant discrimination felt morally wrong. She inhaled deeply. "I'm sure your family would be proud of how you're representing this establishment," Ebony said with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Then she turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Corin's voice followed her. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." Ebony clenched her jaw, pushing the door open into the fresh morning air. The bells jangled again, an ironic echo of the welcome she'd never received. She hurried to her car, heart pounding, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She refused to let them fall. She sat behind the wheel, gripping it for a moment before starting the engine. She had to refocus on her responsibilities on the day ahead. She couldn't let Corin's prejudice derail her, yet her mind whirled. Was this really 2025? How could such open, casual bigotry still flourish? She'd endured microaggressions throughout her life, but this felt especially brazen. Fighting the urge to dwell on it, Ebony pulled out of the lot and turned onto the main road. She had a long drive to Washington, D.C., where she worked. On her phone, she could see notifications from the staff group chat, each message a reminder of the high-stakes meeting she needed to attend. Ebony exhaled and forced herself to concentrate on her presentation, on the data points she'd compiled, on the potential questions that might arise. By the time she reached the government complex, a modern structure of steel and glass, she had managed to set aside most of her anger. Or so she told herself. She parked in her designated space, swiped her ID badge at the security checkpoint, and took the elevator up to her office suite. A few colleagues greeted her, nodding politely. She returned their greetings with a professional smile, but inside, she still felt the bruise of the morning's humiliation. As Ebony settled at her desk, her phone buzzed. She looked down and saw a message from her immediate supervisor, Deputy Director Mark. "Briefing with the director in 15 min, please bring the updated security outline. Urgent." Ebony typed a quick reply and grabbed her notes. She checked her reflection in her phone camera, smoothing any stray hairs, trying to wipe away the lingering tension from her expression. She was used to wearing a mask of composure, a skill honed from years in government positions, where vulnerability was seldom a luxury. She walked down the corridor toward the conference room, passing windows that revealed partial glimpses of the bustling city beyond. Within minutes, Ebony was in the thick of professional discussions, analyzing security protocols for upcoming high-profile events. On any other day, she'd be fully engrossed, her sharp mind and meticulous planning shining through. But that morning, Corin's hateful words hummed in the back of her mind. Ebony forced herself to compartmentalize, something she was quite good at, but it left her mentally exhausted. After the briefing, Mark asked her to stay behind. He was a seasoned government official with salt and pepper hair, always impeccably dressed. "Ebony," he said, fixing her with a concerned gaze, "you seem a bit distracted today. Everything all right?" Ebony hesitated. She considered brushing it off with a quick "I'm fine." But she and Mark had worked together for years, and she respected his mentorship. "I had an incident this morning at a diner," she said carefully, aware that personal issues weren't typically the fodder of workplace conversation. "I faced some blatant discrimination from the manager. It threw me off, I guess." Mark's eyes darkened with sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk about it?" She gave a brief summary, arriving at the diner, the long wait, Corin's rudeness and final remarks. Mark let out a slow breath. "That's awful. People can be cruel, no doubt about it. But you can't let it make you doubt who you are or what you've earned. If there's anything you need from me, let me know." Ebony appreciated his understanding. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm just going to push through and focus on my work. That's what I can control." Mark nodded. "Well, you know we have a big event coming up next week, one the president himself is scheduled to attend. We'll have Secret Service crawling all over the place. I need your final security outline for the arrival logistics, especially regarding the new visitors from overseas. We'll keep you busy, that's for sure." Work, Ebony thought, was indeed the best distraction. She immersed herself in the details, coordinating with the Secret Service team, confirming routes, verifying clearance levels, double-checking guest lists. By late afternoon, she felt more anchored, more like her usual self. The humiliating diner incident had receded into the back of her mind. That evening, however, as Ebony prepared to leave, she caught her reflection in a hallway mirror and noticed the tension etched in her face. She realized how deeply the morning's encounter had affected her. It wasn't merely about rudeness or bad service. It was about the raw, biting prejudice Corin had displayed, one that Ebony had fought against her entire life. At times, Ebony had grown weary of carrying the burden of explaining or proving herself. A part of her whispered that she should file a complaint, leave a damning review of the diner, or do something. But Ebony told herself it wouldn't matter. Corin was the owner's family member. Ebony reasoned that her energy was better spent on meaningful work, not on a small-town bigot who might never change. That week rushed by in a flurry of preparations for the president's visit to Ebony's agency. Ebony worked late into the nights, coordinating with security teams and finalizing every detail from arrival times to media access points. The upcoming event had a level of importance that overshadowed nearly everything else in Ebony's life. She was a critical link between her department and the higher echelons of government, ensuring that intelligence, logistical planning, and safety measures were seamless. On Friday afternoon, Ebony returned to her office from a briefing to find a message waiting from her mother. Just a simple, "Call me when you can." Ebony smiled. She dialed her mom, letting the familiarity of her mother's voice soothe her. They chatted about Ebony's busy schedule and how proud her mom was that Ebony had risen to such a pivotal role in government. But her mother noticed Ebony's subdued tone. "You sound tired, baby," her mom said gently. "Something happened." Ebony hesitated. She hadn't planned on mentioning the diner incident, not wanting to worry her mom. But the memory still stung. She found herself recounting the story, albeit briefly. Her mother sighed. "It hurts my heart to hear that, Ebony. You deserve better. I wish these things were a relic of the past, but here we are." Ebony nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "Thanks, Mom, I'm okay. It's just frustrating." Her mom's voice was firm yet comforting. "You keep your head up, you hear? You've done so well. Don't let anyone drag you down to their level." They hung up soon after, and Ebony felt marginally lighter. She reminded herself of everything she'd accomplished, of all the times she'd refused to let people's hate define her. Perhaps Corin's actions were a reminder that Ebony's fight for respect and equality was never truly over, even as she occupied high-profile positions that most bigots would never imagine a black woman could hold. The weekend passed in a blur of errands and personal obligations, with Ebony occasionally checking her work email and ironing out last-minute details for the president's visit. On Monday, Ebony arrived at the office early, coffee in hand from a different one that greeted her with a warm smile and quick service. She buried herself in work until early evening, when a knock on her office door startled her. She looked up to see a man in a neatly tailored suit, an earpiece coiled behind his ear, standing in the doorway. He had the unmistakable aura of a Secret Service agent. "Ms.," he said, stepping into her office. "I'm agent with the Secret Service. We're going over final checks for tomorrow's visit. We'd like your presence for a quick security." Ebony nodded, grabbing her blazer. "Of course," she said, her tone professional. "I'll come right with you." She spent the next few hours with Agent and his team, walking through the building, identifying potential security vulnerabilities, and discussing last-minute changes. By the time they finished, it was close to midnight. Ebony was exhausted, but she felt a surge of pride in how smoothly everything was coming together. The president's arrival would be a momentous occasion, and Ebony had played a pivotal role in orchestrating it. The next day it dawned bright and chilly. The president was scheduled to arrive mid-morning. Ebony was in the lobby with a small group of officials when a motorcade pulled up. Black SUVs and limousines lined the curb outside, and a flurry of agents stepped out, scanning the area. Ebony moved quickly to position herself near the main doors, ready to greet the president and direct him to the secure conference hall. The moment came with pomp and precision. The president, a tall figure with a calm smile, stepped inside. Ebony introduced herself formally, though they had met on a handful of other occasions. He greeted her with a warm handshake. "Nice to see you again. Thank you for your hard work on this." "It's an honor, Mr. President," Ebony replied, keeping her voice steady despite the swirl of activity around them. She guided him and his entourage down the polished corridors, passing rows of staff who nodded respectfully. Within minutes, the president was in the designated conference room, meeting with foreign delegates and top agency officials. Ebony lingered just outside with several Secret Service agents, including Agent. They listened to the muffled conversation, prepared to respond at a moment's notice. Eventually, Ebony was asked to join the discussion briefly and present some security analyses she'd prepared. She handled it with poised authority, earning appreciative nods from the president and his advisors. By noon, the main portion of the meeting was done. The president had a brief window before his next engagement. Ebony was about to slip away to finalize some paperwork when Agent approached her, an almost bashful smile on his stern face. "Ms., the president said he's starving. We were wondering if there's a quick local spot nearby where we can grab a bite before heading to the next site. The schedule got a bit shuffled, and we have about 30 minutes. Ebony paused, mind automatically filtering through a list of places in the vicinity. She knew some quick sandwich shops around the corner, but on a whim, she remembered Rosewood Diner. Logically, it wasn't any better than the sandwich shops, probably slower, and it certainly hadn't been a pleasant experience for her. Yet a small part of Ebony felt a twinge of defiance at the memory of how Corin had treated her. What would happen if the president and his Secret Service showed up? Would Corin dare to be rude? She hesitated only a second before responding in a neutral tone. "Well, there's a diner not far from here. Rosewood Diner. It's pretty traditional, might be a quick bite if they aren't crowded." She deliberately omitted her previous experience, mostly because it wasn't relevant to the president's schedule, but a spark of curiosity lit up inside her. She glanced at Agent, who was already tapping away on his phone to check the location. "Excellent," he said. "We'll do that, let's move." In minutes, Ebony found herself ushered into one of the black SUVs, part of the motorcade. She rarely traveled in the vehicles used by the president's team, but given her role in the day's events, the agents invited her to come along to keep logistical communications smooth. The convoy set off, weaving through the busy midday streets toward Rosewood Diner. As they pulled into the small parking lot, Ebony's heart fluttered with a mix of nerves and an odd sense of vindication. She recognized the sign, the same bright lettering proclaiming Rosewood Diner in a nostalgic script. She glanced around, noticing it was moderately full. The motorcade's arrival alone was sure to draw attention. Indeed, by the time Ebony stepped out of the SUV behind the president, heads were turning. A swirl of agents fanned out, scanning the area. The president, looking relaxed and confident, walked to the diner's entrance. Inside, the familiar bells chimed as they entered. Talk about a dramatic entrance, Ebony thought. She stood slightly behind the president and agent, feeling tension coil inside her stomach. What if Corin recognized her? What if the staff realized they had refused service to Ebony just days ago? The hush that fell over the diner was almost palpable. Diners paused mid-bite. Conversation died. Corin was behind the counter, flipping through a stack of receipts. She glanced up, presumably expecting just another customer, but her eyes went wide at the sight of the president, flanked by Secret Service agents. Corin's jaw seemed to drop open. She scrambled out from behind the counter, her demeanor a whirlwind of forced hospitality. "Mr. President?" Corin exclaimed, her voice much higher and breathier than the last time Ebony heard it. "What an honor. Welcome. We had no idea. Please have a seat anywhere you like." The president offered a polite grin. "Thank you. We're just grabbing a quick meal. We won't be long." Corin bobbed her head, so eager she almost stumbled over her own feet. She gestured grandly to an empty booth, instructing the staff to clear it immediately. "Right this way, sir. We'll get you set up with whatever you need." As the president slid into the booth, Ebony stood a short distance behind, hands clasped. She was keenly aware of Corin's eyes flicking around at the group, likely trying to identify who was who. Corin's gaze eventually landed on Ebony and froze for a moment. Ebony met Corin's eyes with a calm, level stare. A spark of recognition flickered in Corin's expression. Her lips parted in surprise, but she quickly plastered on a smile for the president. Behind them, a few Secret Service agents took up positions near the entrance and around the diner, monitoring the situation. Agent approached Ebony quietly. "We'll keep this short. The president wants a simple menu, nothing fancy. We'll do the usual protocol checks." Ebony nodded, trying to keep her face neutral, though her pulse was pounding. She watched Corin practically trip over herself to hand the president a menu. "We have the best burgers in town, sir," Corin gushed, her previous tone nowhere in sight. "Or maybe you'd like a nice, fresh salad. I can bring coffee, juice, anything you want." The president chuckled politely, scanning the menu. Ebony felt a surreal sense of displacement. The same woman who had snarled about "you people" days ago was now bending over backwards to serve the most powerful person in the country. And Ebony was right there, part of the official entourage. She kept her face impassive, but inside she felt an odd swirl of anger and amusement. As Corin hovered, Ebony cleared her throat. "I'd like some water, please," she said softly, recalling how Corin had refused to bring her water last time. Corin turned, eyes narrowing slightly at Ebony, but with the president right there, she forced a saccharine smile. "Of course, ma'am," she said, voice trembling with barely concealed confusion. She hurried off to fetch drinks. Meanwhile, the president asked Ebony to join him at the booth. "Ms.," he said, patting the seat, "you've worked tirelessly all morning. Let's have a quick bite before we head out." "Can stand guard over the place," he joked, glancing at the agent. Ebony hesitated, then slid into the booth beside the president, facing the diner. Across the room, Corin stood at the beverage station, her posture rigid. She placed 2 glasses of water on a tray and then paused, seemingly mustering the composure to come back and face Ebony in front of the president. When she did return, Ebony noticed Corin's hand shook slightly as she set the water on the table. "Water for you?" Corin asked, her voice faltering. She clearly wasn't sure how to address Ebony. "Ms.," Ebony said quietly, taking the glass. She thanked Corin politely, just as she had done days ago. Corin opened her mouth as if to say something, but the president captured her attention by asking about the day's specials. She eagerly listed them, turning all her attention to the president, while Ebony watched, her mind churning. Within a few minutes, the president ordered a burger with fries, Ebony asked for a chef's salad, and the Secret Service detail placed various orders to go. Corin scribbled everything down, her words pouring out in a breathy rush of, "Yes, sir. Right away, sir. Excellent choice, sir." When Corin hurried back toward the kitchen, Ebony leaned slightly toward the president. "If I may, sir, I'd like to step outside for a moment, just to make a quick call regarding our next location." He gave her a friendly nod. "Of course, Ebony, take your time." Ebony scooted out of the booth and walked past the line of curious onlookers. Once outside, she took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She pulled out her phone, pretending to make a call, but really she just needed a moment to steady herself. The swirl of events, the humiliating encounter days ago, the shock of returning with the president, felt like poetic irony. Ebony reminded herself to remain composed. She wouldn't stoop to Corin's level. She'd remain civil, no matter how tempting it might be to expose the woman's hypocrisy. After a minute, Ebony re-entered the diner. She saw Corin emerging from the kitchen with plates. The Secret Service agents who had placed to-go orders stood near the counter. Ebony returned to her seat beside the president. He offered her a smile, asking if she'd taken care of everything. Ebony nodded, offering a quick update that everything was fine for their next stop. As the food arrived, Ebony noticed Corin's forced politeness again. The bright smile for the president, the slight hesitation whenever she interacted with Ebony. The difference was glaring. Ebony could tell Corin recognized her, but the presence of the president and his entire security detail had forced a radical change in Corin's attitude. A part of Ebony wanted to confront Corin directly, but she kept her silence. The president was enjoying a casual meal, and Ebony didn't want to tarnish that moment with personal conflict. They ate quickly, with the president commenting that the burger was surprisingly good, praising the diner's old-fashioned charm. Ebony's salad was decent enough, fresher than the rubbery omelet she'd received before. Corin hovered near the booth, checking in frequently, ensuring the coffee was refilled, the president's water glass never empty. Ebony couldn't help but notice the difference from her last experience. She half smiled to herself, the irony not lost on her. When they finished, the president asked for the check. Corin, practically stumbling over her own feet, assured him that the meal was on the house. "Our treat, Mr. President. It's such an honor to have you here." The president chuckled, but insisted on paying. He handed Corin a crisp bill, telling her to keep the change as a thank you for the hospitality. Ebony hid a private smirk at that word. Corin swallowed, looking flustered, and accepted the payment. The entire diner seemed mesmerized by the scene. The President of the United States casually tossing bills onto a diner counter, the swirl of Secret Service, Ebony calmly at his side. As they stood to leave, Ebony braced herself for the final interaction. The president paused to shake Corin's hand, politely thanking her for a lovely meal. Then the president turned to Ebony, beckoning her forward. "Ebony, we should thank Ms. Corin for accommodating us on short notice." Ebony stepped up, meeting Corin's eyes fully. Corin's face was pale, her eyes flicked with recognition and discomfort. In a quiet voice, Ebony said, "Thank you for your service today." She extended her hand. Corin hesitated, then took it, her grip clammy. She opened her mouth as if to say something, an apology perhaps, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she gave a shaky smile, nodded, and managed. "You're welcome, Miss. Please, do come again." Ebony inclined her head. "We'll see," she answered simply. There was no malice in her tone, just calm finality. With that, Ebony followed the president and the entourage out the door. The bells tinkled overhead again, marking their departure as the small crowd in the diner leaned toward the windows, gawking. Outside, Ebony caught Agent's eye. He gave her a knowing look. Perhaps he'd sensed some unspoken tension. Ebony just offered him a polite nod, leaving any explanation for another time. The motorcade loaded up, and in moments they were on the road again, off to the next event. Inside the SUV, Ebony felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Relief, validation, a hint of lingering anger. Mostly, she realized how important it was to maintain grace in the face of bigotry. She thought about what had just happened. Corin, so brazenly cruel when Ebony was alone, had been obsequious and fearful when faced with the power of the presidency and the presence of the Secret Service. Ebony had no desire to exploit that power for personal revenge, but it was deeply gratifying to see the stark change in Corin's behavior. Ebony let out a silent exhale and turned her attention to the president, who was reviewing some notes. She reminded herself that she had more important tasks at hand than worrying about a diner's small-minded manager. Later that day, as the president concluded his visit, Ebony returned to her office, feeling a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. She had done her job seamlessly. Everything went off without a hitch. In the final debrief, Mark commended her for her thorough planning. Even the president's staffers extended their thanks, praising Ebony's efficiency. Only after the final wrap-up did Ebony have a moment to sit alone in her office and process everything. She recalled Corin's stunned expression when Ebony had walked in behind the president. It was a memory she would carry for a long time. That evening, Ebony left the building and made her way home in the twilight glow of the city. During her commute, her phone buzzed with a text from one of the junior staffers. They had apparently seen the news. A local reporter had snapped a quick photo of the president at Rosewood Diner, Ebony in the background, standing near him. The picture was circulating on social media. "OMG, Ebony, you're all over Twitter," the staffer wrote, adding excited emojis. Ebony smiled faintly at the screen. She doubted the world would ever know the deeper story behind that snapshot, the quiet personal victory it represented. As the days turned into weeks, Ebony threw herself back into her standard routine. Another major event required her focus. She rarely thought about Rosewood Diner, except when occasionally telling close friends the story of how she'd returned with the president. They laughed with her, sharing in the sense of cosmic irony. Even her mother was delighted to hear about it, exclaiming, "See, baby, God has a funny way of teaching lessons." Then one afternoon, Ebony's desk phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged her to pick up. "Ebony," she answered formally. A hesitant female voice came through. "Ms., my name is Susan Barnes. I'm the owner of Rosewood Diner. Corin is my sister. She helps run the place." Ebony felt her grip on the phone tighten. Why was the diner's owner calling her at work? She remained polite. "Yes, Ms. Barnes, how can I help you?" Susan cleared her throat. "First, let me say I'm sorry if this is an intrusion. I got your number from the business card you left with one of my staff the last time you visited a few months back. They found it near the counter. I wanted to reach out personally." Ebony had indeed left a business card at some point, likely to confirm a final receipt or something else. She guessed a staff member had kept it. "I understand," Ebony said. "What's this about?" Susan exhaled, and Ebony could hear the tension in her voice. "We've had some issues lately. People in town have heard about the incident, about Corin's behavior. Some customers have stopped coming. And then the photos of the president's visit circulated, and word got around that Corin might have treated you, a high-ranking government official, unfairly. I think a few employees overheard or pieced things together. So I wanted to call and apologize, and to ask if you'd be willing to speak with me." Ebony paused, grappling with an array of emotions. Part of her felt justified that the diner was facing backlash. Another part felt uneasy about being asked to fix their reputation. Still, Ebony believed in giving people a chance to do better. "Ms. Barnes," she said carefully, "I appreciate the apology. But your sister made it very clear that she felt how she felt. An apology after the fact doesn't erase the humiliation or the bigotry I experienced." Susan hurried to respond. I understand that. Please know I'm deeply sorry. It's not how our father built that business. He raised us to treat everyone with respect. Corinne has her own issues, but it's unacceptable. I was hoping to meet with you to express my regret in person, maybe see if there's a way we can repair some of the damage. I want everyone to feel welcome in our diner. Ebony frowned, letting silence hang for a moment. She replayed Corinne's hateful remarks in her mind, still raw despite the time that had passed. Yet Ebony felt a stir of empathy. I'm not sure what you expect of me, Ms. Barnes. I'm not in the business of rehabilitating the reputations of private establishments. Susan sounded on the brink of tears. I know, I'm not asking for a public endorsement or anything. I just want to do it right. I want to show you that we're serious about making changes, maybe diversity training for staff, or donating part of our proceeds to a cause that supports racial equity. And I'd like to do it with sincerity, not just for show. She paused, voice trembling. If you'd meet me, I'd be grateful. If not, I understand. Ebony looked at her calendar. She was free the following Friday morning. There was a part of her that wanted to see if this was real or just another performance for damage control. She sighed. I can give you 30 minutes on Friday morning, but only to talk, Ms. Barnes. I'm not making any promises. Susan exhaled shakily, relief evident in her voice. Thank you, I appreciate it. When you arrive, just ask for me. They exchanged a few more details, and Ebony hung up, feeling a knot of apprehension in her gut. Why was she agreeing to go back there? She reasoned that maybe in some small way it could lead to progress, or at least she could see if the apology was genuine. That night, Ebony tried to push away her doubts as she fell asleep, but her dreams were restless. Friday morning came, crisp and sunny. Ebony had arranged a late start at the office. She dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, not wanting to appear too formal or stand out more than she already would. With a swirl of conflicting thoughts, she drove to Rosewood Diner, arriving a few minutes past 9. The parking lot was half empty, the sign reading "Open" in the front window. Ebony parked, sat in her car for a moment, then mustered the courage to go inside. The bells chimed overhead, instantly sending a memory through Ebony of that previous, painful morning. But this time the place was quieter, and a different waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted Ebony warmly. Ebony asked for Susan Barnes, and the waitress nodded, leading her to a small office in the back, near the kitchen. Ebony could smell bacon sizzling, coffee brewing. She tried to steady her breathing. Susan Barnes turned out to be a petite woman in her early 40s, hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, no airs or pretense. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been up worrying or even crying. She stood the moment Ebony walked in, offering a tentative smile. "Ms., thank you for coming." Ebony gave a polite nod. "Susan." Susan gestured to a chair. Ebony sat, crossing her legs. She noticed a small photograph on the desk, a black and white snapshot of a man in a cook's apron, presumably their father. Susan followed Ebony's gaze. "That's my dad, Bill Barnes. He opened this place decades ago with the hope it would serve everyone in the community." She let out a shaky sigh. Somehow, Corinne lost sight of that. Ebony remained quiet, letting Susan speak. Susan cleared her throat. "First, please allow me to apologize on behalf of my family. I know Corinne has offered no personal apology, and I won't make excuses for her. She was wrong to treat you or anyone like that. It was racist and cruel. I only found out the depth of it when some of my employees told me what was said. Then, when I saw the photos of you with the president, I realized who she'd been so awful to. And I felt sick." Ebony's expression softened slightly. At least Susan wasn't deflecting or denying. "It wasn't just about me being a government official," Ebony said quietly. "Even if I worked in retail or was unemployed, her treatment would have been unacceptable." Susan nodded emphatically. "Absolutely, and I want to make this right. I'm in the process of buying Corinne's share of the diner from her. She's stepping down as manager. She'll no longer be the face of Rosewood Diner. We'll probably hire a professional manager. Meanwhile, I want to implement real changes, diversity workshops for all staff, a clear code of conduct that states we serve everyone equally, no exceptions. I'm also partnering with a local nonprofit that addresses racial disparities in our community. We plan to donate a portion of our monthly profits to them." Ebony studied her, trying to gauge sincerity. She could sense the genuineness in Susan's tremulous voice. "That sounds like a good start," Ebony allowed. "But changes on paper don't mean much unless the culture changes too." Susan looked down at her hands. "I know. I guess that's why I asked you here. I hope to talk about how we can ensure these changes are real. I know it's not your job to educate us or to fix what Corin broke, but you're someone I admire, someone who's clearly a leader. I was hoping for some guidance, if you're willing. Ebony felt a pang of empathy. She also felt a flicker of relief that Corin wasn't present. Perhaps Corin was too stubborn or ashamed to face Ebony again. Ebony considered the request. "I'm not a diversity consultant," she said gently, "but I appreciate that you're taking ownership. If you want my advice, make sure your staff understands that discrimination of any form is not tolerated. Put it in your policies. Reinforce it in training. And then you enforce it, no exceptions. If someone violates it, you let them go. That's how a culture changes." Susan nodded vigorously, taking notes on a small notepad. Ebony also suggested some local resources, community organizations that could help with training or outreach. She mentioned the possibility of hosting events that celebrate the area's diversity, letting people see the diner as a welcoming place. The conversation lasted longer than Ebony expected, nearly an hour. By the end, Susan's eyes were watery. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know we have a lot to make up for, but I'll do everything I can to make this diner what my dad dreamed it would be." Ebony stood, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "I appreciate your effort," she replied. "I hope it goes well." Susan walked her out into the main dining area, which was still quiet. The older waitress who had greeted Ebony offered a polite wave. At the counter stood a man Ebony recognized from her first visit, perhaps a cook or dishwasher. He glanced up, then looked down again, his expression uncertain. Ebony returned his nod politely. As Ebony neared the door, Susan's voice stopped her. "Ms. Ebony, would you allow me to make you something before you go? Anything you want on the house. This time served right." Ebony considered it. Part of her wanted to decline. But she also realized what a profound statement it would be for her to freely accept the service that was once so rudely. She glanced at her watch, noticing she still had a bit of time before she had to be at work. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, I'll have a coffee black and maybe a short stack of pancakes." Susan's face lit with relief. "Of course. Right away, please have a seat wherever you like." Ebony chose a booth near the window. The older waitress promptly brought her coffee with a smile, and Ebony sipped it, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the same diner, the same checkered floors, the same chrome table edges. Yet the atmosphere felt different, contrite, hopeful. In a few minutes, Susan herself came out with a plate of pancakes, steam rising from the golden surface. She set it in front of Ebony, quietly remarking, "I hope you like them. My dad's old recipe." Ebony took a forkful, the sweet, warm flavor melting in her mouth. It tasted worlds better than the soggy omelet she'd had before. She watched Susan hover, looking anxious for approval. Ebony offered a small smile. "They're good," she said simply. Susan beamed, stepping back to give Ebony space to eat. While Ebony finished, she thought about how a small act, like serving pancakes, could become symbolic of a deeper shift. She wasn't enough to believe that one meeting would cure prejudice or that Corin would suddenly be a changed person. But Ebony recognized that progress often came in incremental steps. Perhaps if every act of bigotry was met with accountability and the chance for sincere redemption, society could inch forward. After Ebony finished, Susan refused any payment. "Please let this be the start of something better," she insisted. Ebony acquiesced, thanking her softly. On her way out, Ebony caught one last glimpse of the photograph of Bill Barnes behind the counter. She silently hoped that, wherever he was, he'd see these efforts and be proud of the attempt to restore his original vision. In the days and weeks that followed, Ebony continued her work at the agency, navigating the complexities of government security and policy. She didn't become personally involved with Rosewood Diner's transformation efforts. She had her own life, her own demanding career. But she did hear, through a local news snippet, that Rosewood Diner had announced new ownership and a revised policy statement welcoming all patrons with open arms. A local reporter interviewed Susan Barnes, who spoke humbly about wanting to ensure her father's legacy thrived in unity rather than division. As for Corin, Ebony didn't hear any direct updates. Rumors suggested she had relocated or was simply out of the diner's day-to-day operations. It was unclear if she had learned anything from the experience, but Ebony chose to let that go. One couldn't force reflection on another person. Corin would have to confront her own conscience. Ebony's life moved forward. She continued to excel in her role, earning the respect and admiration of her colleagues. She still encountered discrimination, subtle or overt, because that was the reality of living in a world still rife with prejudice. But she refused to let it define her. Each time she faced it with composure and a resolve to push for better. On a quiet weekend about a month after the diner incident, Ebony sat on her balcony overlooking the Potomac River. She sipped tea, phone in hand, scrolling through the news. She came across an op-ed discussing small businesses that had chosen to break away from discriminatory practices in the region. To her surprise, Rosewood Diner was mentioned as a shining example of a place that had turned things around. The piece mentioned the diner's new manager, a young woman from the local community college who was implementing modern, inclusive practices. It also highlighted how the diner had hosted a small event for local youth groups, letting them raise funds for community programs. Ebony felt a gentle satisfaction. Maybe her short meeting with Susan had helped nudge the establishment onto a better path. Setting her phone aside, Ebony closed her eyes, letting the evening breeze brush her cheeks. She thought of that fateful day she first walked into Rosewood Diner, hoping for a simple omelet, only to be met with hostility. She remembered the shame, the anger, and the subsequent turn of events, how she'd ended up returning with the president, the Secret Service trailing behind. Corin's stunned face was etched into Ebony's memory. Yet the real power, Ebony realized, came from how she chose to respond after that moment. She hadn't let hatred consume her. She'd remained true to herself and her values, and eventually she'd had the opportunity to encourage positive change. That, she reflected, was the deeper moral. When confronted with cruelty or prejudice, it's natural to feel anger and hurt. But transformation, both personal and societal, depends on individuals who channel that anger into constructive action. Ebony had faced the sting of Corin's racism, only to see karmic justice arrive in the form of the president's unexpected visit. Yet the true justice, the true victory, lay in what came next, the chance to foster understanding, accountability, and progress. Corin may or may not have learned her lesson, but the diner under new leadership had a renewed commitment to inclusivity. Ebony's own resolve to excel in her career and personal life only strengthened, reminding her that dignity in the face of adversity can spark ripples beyond what we immediately see. That night, as the stars flickered above the river, Ebony allowed herself a moment of contentment. She thought about her mother's comforting words, about Mark's quiet support, and about all those who believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She savored the knowledge that, in a small corner of Virginia, a once hostile diner was now a place that welcomed everyone. And while Ebony knew the fight against prejudice was far from over, she also knew that every step forward mattered. In that sense, the day Corin refused to serve a black woman, and subsequently found herself scrambling when the Secret Service and the president arrived, had turned into a catalyst for a moral reckoning and ultimately a path toward something better. Ebony rose from her chair, finishing the last sip of her tea. She glanced out at the water one more time, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring another series of challenges, meetings, and demands on her schedule. But in her heart, she carried the unshakable certainty that no single act of hate, no matter how small or large, could ever define her worth. She would continue to serve her country, stand up for herself and others, and shine a light on the better angels of human nature wherever she could. And as she closed her balcony door behind her, she smiled, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, the next time she stepped into a diner like Rosewood, she'd be greeted with nothing less than the respect and dignity every human being deserves.